Welcome to the One in the Many. My name is Arshak Ben-Lian. My purpose with the One in the Many podcast is to explore the process of integration as developmentally formative and therapeutically corrective factor in human psychology. The One in the Many is the study of how conscious life differentiates identity, integrates relation, regulates itself under constraint, and sustains direction through time. Subscribe to the One in the Many podcast and connect with me by writing to abenlian@oneinthemany.net. Clarity is often mistaken for stylistic simplicity or rhetorical elegance. In fact, clarity is neither primarily aesthetic nor merely communicative. It is structural. A statement is clear to the extent that it enables another mind to identify its reference, follow its causal sequence, and extend its implications without distortion. Thus, clarity must be understood across three integrated levels: structural intelligibility, causal replicability, and generative integration. Only when these converge does clarity become fully operative. The first level of clarity is structural. A statement is intelligible when its internal organization aligns with the architecture of cognition. Defined reference, contextual placement, hierarchical ordering, and explicit logical relations. Words must point to identifiable units of reality or well-formed abstractions derived from them. Context must stabilize meaning by specifying scope, scale, and domain. And the sequence of ideas must unfold across levels of abstraction without conflation. Where these conditions hold, the listener can perform the essential cognitive operations of identification, integration, and application without strain. Structural clarity, therefore, is the minimum condition of understanding. Yet it remains insufficient because intelligibility alone does not guarantee reproducibility. The second level of clarity is causal. A statement becomes operationally clear only when its inferential transitions form a continuous and traceable chain. To clarify, the next logical step is to specify the transformation linking one state to another under defined constraints. Every replicable step, therefore, requires four articulated elements: the current state, the governing conditions, the operative mechanism, and the measurable outcome. When these are explicit, the listener can independently reproduce the result. When any link is missing, clarity changes status. If the omitted step is recoverable by necessity, clarity remains functionally intact for trained observers. If multiple transitions are plausible, clarity becomes conditional. If the missing link contains causal necessity, clarity collapses entirely. Thus, causal continuity marks the boundary between descriptive understanding and scientific clarity. Yet even causal clarity does not exhaust the function of clarity. The highest level is generative. Once the causal chain is intact, the question shifts. What determines the next integration? The answer lies not in preference but in necessity. Every coherent abstraction leaves residual variance, meets boundary conditions, and implies mediating variables not yet specified. The next integrative move emerges precisely where the present model fails, where predictions weaken, where explanatory compression breaks, and where context exceeds its scope. In this sense, clarity is inherently dynamic. It compels expansion by exposing what remains unresolved. Operationally, generative clarity follows a consistent method. One begins by analyzing residual anomalies, the observations insufficiently explained by the current model. One then maps the boundaries of the system across scale, domain, and time. Next, one identifies the implied but missing mediating mechanism linking unresolved elements. Finally, one selects the integration that yields maximal predictive leverage while reducing degrees of freedom. Through this process, clarity evolves recursively, advancing from structural comprehension to causal control and ultimately to generative discovery. Seen together, these three dimensions reveal clarity as an integrative gradient rather than a binary state. Structural clarity makes meaning communicable. Causal clarity makes outcomes reproducible. Generative clarity makes knowledge expandable. Their unity explains why clarity is rare. It requires alignment across language, logic, mechanism, and context simultaneously. Where any dimension fails, clarity degrades into ambiguity, approximation, or fragmentation. In its fullest sense, clarity is not merely the successful expression of thought. It is the successful transmission and extension of ordered knowledge. A statement is fully clear only when it allows another mind not merely to understand it, but to reconstruct its process and advance it further. This dynamic establishes clarity as structural intelligibility, causal replicability, and generative integration. Yet this leaves one question unresolved. What organizes these elements in lived action? Structure alone does not determine relevance. Causality alone does not determine priority. Generative expansion alone does not determine direction. Each requires a governing principle that assigns salience and sequence within real context. That principle is purpose. It is purpose that selects which structures matter, which causal relations deserve attention, and which integrations must follow next. Without purpose, clarity remains formally intact yet practically inert. With purpose, clarity becomes directional. Thus, the inquiry must shift from how clarity is formed to how clarity is guided, moving from clarity as a property of statements to clarity as a function of agency. Clarity is not secured by structure alone nor by causal continuity alone. Both are necessary, yet neither is sufficient. The decisive clarifying agent is purpose. Purpose orders attention, assigns salience, sequences action, and determines what counts as relevant within any causal chain. Without it, even technically sound reasoning remains inert. With it, ambiguity resolves into direction. Thus, clarity reaches full expansion only where structure, causality, and purpose converge. The master-apprentice relation offers the clearest illustration. The master does not merely present information. He organizes experience around the telos. Every instruction, correction, and demonstration is intelligible because it serves an end the apprentice is learning to see. The apprentice's clarity evolves not through passive reception but through progressive alignment of purpose. At first, the apprentice imitates actions without grasping their full necessity. Over time, as the underlying aim becomes internalized, the sequence of steps reveals itself as coherent. Eventually, the apprentice teaches others because purpose has migrated from external directive to internal principle. In this progression, clarity advances from structural comprehension to causal mastery to generative independence. Purpose is the integrating constant throughout. This same principle governs financial markets, though in a far more complex and adversarial field. Markets appear unclear not simply because they are stochastic, but because they are relational systems composed of agents operating under divergent purposes across time horizons and risk tolerances. Each participant assigns value salience differently. The high-frequency trader prioritizes microstructure signals over milliseconds. The hedge fund models causality across quarters. The pension fund seeks stability across decades. The result is not merely uncertainty, but layered misalignment of salience. What appears causally obvious at one temporal scale may be irrelevant or misleading at another. Here, uncertainty functions less as ignorance than as obfuscation of the clarity stimulus. Participants often misidentify causality because they misplace its temporal assignment. A price move attributed to fundamentals may in fact reflect liquidity imbalance. A macro narrative may obscure positioning flows. A long-term trend may be interrupted by short-term volatility mistaken for reversal. Losses frequently arise not from flawed causal logic, but from applying correct reasoning at the wrong temporal horizon. In this sense, the market punishes misaligned purpose more reliably than mistaken analysis. To gain certainty, therefore, it is insufficient to clarify the causal chain in isolation. One must clarify the distribution of purpose across participants. This requires mapping three dimensions simultaneously. The time horizon within which each agent acts, the level of risk each is structured to absorb, and the value priorities governing their decisions. Only then does causality become intelligible relationally. What appears noise at one level becomes signal at another. What appears irrational at one horizon becomes rational at another. Clarity emerges through proportional alignment of these layers. Seen through this lens, markets are not inherently unclear. They are multi-purpose systems whose clarity depends on one's positional integration within them. Structural clarity identifies the variables. Causal clarity traces their interactions. Purpose clarifies which interactions matter and when. Without purpose, participants drown in data. With misaligned purpose, they misread causality. With integrated purpose, they perceive coherence amid uncertainty. The broader implication is that clarity is fundamentally teleological. It does not arise merely from correct description or correct inference, but from correct orientation toward ends. In pedagogy, in science, in markets alike, the next logical step becomes visible only when its function within the whole is understood. Purpose thus transforms clarity from static understanding into directed action. It is the principle by which knowledge not only communicates and replicates, but advances. In its fullest sense, clarity is achieved when an agent can identify the structure of a problem, replicate its causal process, and situate both within a hierarchy of purposes unfolding across time. Only at that point does clarity cease to be elusive and become operative. If purpose clarifies action within any domain, then psychological development itself must unfold along the vector of purpose. The master-apprentice relation and the dynamics of financial markets both demonstrate that clarity depends on how ends are ordered across time and risk. Yet these examples raise a deeper question. How does purpose shape the formation of the self across time? To answer this requires moving from relational systems to developmental systems. Where earlier analysis showed how purpose organizes clarity among agents, the next step is to show how purpose organizes clarity within the individual. The problem shifts from coordination across participants to integration across stages of maturation. In this shift, clarity reveals its motivational and energetic character, and development emerges as the recursive refinement of purpose itself. The developmental arc of psychological maturation is not governed primarily by age, circumstance, or even intelligence, but by the direction and clarity of one's purpose. Development is directional before it is chronological. Individuals mature to the extent that their purposes become more explicit, more integrated, and more temporally extended. In this sense, clarity is not merely cognitive, it is motivational and energetic. The clarity of one's vision determines the clarity of one's execution because purpose organizes attention, regulates energy, and guides correction across successive cycles of action. Purpose functions as the organizing vector of psychological life. Where purpose is diffuse, perception fragments, effort disperses, and development stalls. Where purpose is defined, perception becomes selective, action becomes coherent, and development accelerates. This occurs because clarity reduces uncertainty about what matters, what follows, and what may be ignored. Motivation is not fundamentally emotional, it is epistemic. One acts with energy not simply because one feels strongly, but because one sees clearly. The will strengthens where understanding stabilizes. The energetic function of clarity follows directly from its motivational role. Where purpose is unclear, attention divides across competing alternatives. Decisions multiply unnecessarily, and error correction becomes costly. Fatigue accumulates not from exertion itself, but from friction within the decision process. By contrast, clear purpose compresses action into fewer, more decisive moves. Effort becomes directional rather than dissipative. Physiologically and psychologically alike, energy flows most efficiently through systems that minimize internal conflict and maximize coherence. Clarity in this respect is not merely illuminating, it is economizing. Yet clarity alone does not ensure advancement. Development unfolds through recursive cycles of integration that continuously test and refine direction. Each cycle begins with orientation, the articulation of aim within context. Execution follows, constrained by available resources and conditions. Feedback then emerges through outcomes, which must be interpreted rather than merely observed. Finally comes integration, in which the agent either strengthens the present course or adjusts it. Through this recursive process, development advances not in a straight line, but in a spiral, propelled forward by correction. Every such cycle within a purposeful system performs one of two functions. It either propels the advance by confirming direction and corrects the advance by revealing deviation. Psychological growth depends not on avoiding error, but on shortening the distance between action and recalibration. Where purpose remains clear, even failure becomes instructive. Where purpose is confused, even success misleads. Two characteristic distortions follow when purpose and clarity fall out of alignment. The first is propulsive error, strong energy coupled with weak clarity. In this condition, individuals move rapidly but without direction, exhausting resources while amplifying mistakes. The second is paralyzed precision, strong clarity coupled with weak execution. Here, understanding accumulates without transformation, producing stagnation rather than growth. Maturation requires both directional coherence and operational engagement. Across the developmental continuum, purpose itself evolves. Early development is guided largely by external aims imposed by authority and environment. Transitional stages internalize these aims into identity-based pursuits. Mature stages ground purpose in principles rather than circumstances. At the highest level, purpose becomes generative, oriented not only toward personal achievement, but toward systemic contribution and renewal. Psychological maturation thus corresponds to increasing autonomy, integration, and temporal depth of purpose. Clarity, therefore, is best understood as a dynamic property of purposeful systems rather than a static attribute of thought. It motivates by organizing salience, energizes by organizing expenditure, and develops by organizing correction. Every cycle of integration within the system of one's purpose either propels advancement or redirects it. In this sense, clarity ceases to be elusive once purpose stabilizes. It becomes operative, guiding action, conserving energy, and shaping the unfolding arc of the self. Taken together, these three analyses describe a single movement. The first defines clarity as a structural and causal achievement. The second demonstrates that clarity becomes operative only when guided by purpose within relational systems. The third shows that purpose itself develops through recursive cycles of integration that shape the trajectory of the self. Thus, clarity progresses from condition to function to force. First as the condition of understanding, then as the function of coordinated action, and finally as the force driving psychological maturation. Seen in this unified arc, clarity is not an isolated cognitive virtue, but the dynamic expression of purposeful integration across thought, action, and development. This is the one in the many. The principle of life is the process of integration from a single cell to an ideal human being. The story of life unfolds through integration, from a single percept to a library of knowledge. Through virtue, reason, honesty, independence, selfishness, productivity, you set your values, purpose, to achieve self-esteem and happiness. Through time and energy, from induction to integration to reduction, the smallest particle unifies matter, and the highest purpose unifies your life. You, the one in the many, matter. May you integrate your life with value-driven days.